Good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining us today for the final session of our webinar series. I'm Jim Morrison, the president of the Hudson River Environmental Society. Today's seminar, part 5, Making Sense of It All, reunites 5 speakers from our previous sessions to discuss the critical knowledge gaps that will need to be addressed as we prioritize the areas of environmental research that will be critical for assessing and monitoring future ecological health of the region. I want to thank Clay, Jim, Chuck, John, Sam, our co-sponsors, Central Hudson, HDR Engineering, and Interfluve, and all the speakers who have participated in our symposium. It's been my privilege to play a small role in this very informative and enjoyable webinar series. If you want to learn more about HRES, please visit us at our website at hres.org. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Clay Hiles, the Executive Director of the Hudson River Foundation.
Thank you, Jim. Let me add my thanks to all of that Jim said, with which I agree and endorse, and second, to Jim himself, who's been just a terrific colleague in many ways, and particularly recently in putting together this first of its kind, but I hope not last, symposium. In a very real sense, this would not be happening the way it is, like so many other things that happen the way they happen on the Hudson River and in our work, were it not for Dennis Sikowski. And it is because of that that we are very pleased that HRES and the Hudson River Foundation have dedicated this symposium to Dennis in his memory. I always can remember easily my children's birthdays and my life at the Hudson River Foundation because of their coincidence in various ways. If I can remember my daughter's birth date, I can remember when I first came to the Hudson River Foundation, which was 2 months before. And before I actually arrived, but had agreed to take the job and resign from my previous employment, I came in from a Block Island vacation to spend the day at the foundation and what was then the Hudson River panel, which was composed of various signatories to the original Hudson River Power Plant Settlement Agreement. Those were the days of kind of rough and tumble Hudson River environmental politics, occasional sandwich fights, but generally it was just people disagreeing with each other vehemently. And I remember leaving that meeting thinking, oh my gosh, what have I done here? And looking over the edge of the Block Island Ferry to think if that was possibly the deepest part of Block Island Sound, and should I leap? Knowing that I had now Rachel's expectant mother waiting for me, I stayed on the boat. I think I also stayed on the boat because I began to think about the positive parts of my day, and certainly nothing was more reassuring than the fact that there had been an adult in the room. That adult, of course, was Dennis Sikowski. After I got to the foundation, I was given a stack of resumes of pretty hefty scientists who had applied to become the science director of the Hudson River Foundation. There was about to be vacancy in that position. I read them and I tried to figure out what they meant, and I invited a few people in to meet with me. And then after another couple of meetings of the Hudson River panel, so-called, it's gone now, by the way. The food fights have ended and the panel has been replaced by lots of specialized panels, among which many of you have been members. And I looked up one day and I was talking to a staff member and said, what am I going to do with all these resumes? And it was the same day that that person came to me and said, you know, these guys, meaning the people on the Hudson River panel, are the worst. Dennis is the only person who takes his coffee cup into the kitchen. And I thought, that's it. I called Dennis, and he was then at EPA, and I think over a $2 tuna fish sandwich or something at the EPA dining room, I said, Dennis, after a small talk about what was going on, and we were getting to know each other, I said, how would you like to be science director of the Hudson River Foundation? That was pretty intuitive at that point. And He was pretty shocked since he hadn't applied for the job and had not thought about it with any interest. And within a month, Dennis had given notice where he was, cleaned up his business there, and it became, for the next almost 33 years, the science director of the Hudson River Foundation. It was the first serious and easily the best decision I made. I've often thought that when the Hudson River Foundation Board of Directors calls me in for a particularly stern performance review, fortunately, they won't be doing that anymore, I would say three things. Dennis Sikowski, 17 Battery Place and the view of the harbor. And now I can add to that Jonathan Kramer, who I am pleased to declare I brought into the world and the family of the Hudson River Foundation. I think you probably all know Dennis's sort of who's who biography. I will show you this sort of Bachrach photo of Herr Professor Sikowski. Did I do that right? I think I did. There are a lot of copies of this around, and so I always show him first as Dennis, the distinguished scientist and science director. He came to us with degrees from Rutgers, Stony Brook, the University of Delaware, where he received a doctorate in marine science. After that, he launched a career in which he played for more than 40 years a key role in bringing understanding of and solutions to a vast array of significant environmental issues facing the Hudson River and the watershed. Early in his career, Dennis served as Deputy Chief of Operations of the New York District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and then Chief of the Marine and Wetlands Protection Branch at EPA's regional office. He had something of a career baptism by fire at those places. Those of you who are old enough and still alive remember that was the time of Westway, in which he found out what it's like to deal with a whole array of forces impinging, including the interests of striped bass. Dennis chaired the Hudson River Estuary Advisory Committee, as Fran will tell you in a minute. I would be surprised if she doesn't say that asking me to whether Dennis could come spend some of his Hudson River Foundation time chairing that committee was one of the best decisions she ever made. And my saying yes was probably another one of my decisions that I'm proud to remember. He served on a lot of advisory boards at Monmouth, at Stevens Institute. He was an adjunct professor at Monmouth. He received various awards, including one from the Hudson River Environmental Society. He was the hero of the harbor from the award given by the Metropolitan Waterfront Alliance. To all of these activities, Dennis brought a keen, critical mind, complete integrity, and an unflagging commitment of energy and attention. But for thousands of people who came into contact with him over the course of his career, they knew there was much more that embodied those qualities and made him a leader without peer in the Hudson River environmental community. So how did he do for the Hudson, all of this for those of us who care about the Hudson and to whom it matters? First, Dennis himself cared. He cared about the science, he cared about data and knowledge and information, good starting points for a science director. And he cared about the people who came to the Hudson River and would come to the Hudson River Foundation from all directions, all professions, policies, politics. We learn, I think, all of us in life at some point that caring is a lot about listening. And though our memories of Dennis are inevitably recollections of his speaking to the issues before him and us, he was a listener. The kind that we all strive in theory to be, taking seriously, though not naively, God knows he was nobody's fool, our colleagues' points of view. He brought to the work of HRS Science Director the deep and inquisitive intellect of a trained scientist, the real world perspective of the dedicated staffs of the government agencies where he worked before coming to us, and the heart and soul of a tree and fish hugging environmentalist. There we go. Dennis, the listener. Lots of different people, lots of different places. Dennis listened. Because he listened to us, we listened to Dennis. His experience and capacity for thoughtful analysis were the basis of strongly held and clearly articulated views about science and policy. We heard him and we listened. Above all, his interest in the people around him and his easy grace in communicating that interest inspired generations of scientists, government officials, environmentalists, and members of the public at large to pay attention, to give their best as he gave his to things that really matter. Dennis was also a man not just listening and speaking, but of dialogue. In all sorts of situations, Dennis, with a kind of easy intensity, explained to us what we needed to know. He did this often at convenings at the Hudson River Foundation and other places, where we learned that really what we could do as well as anything, and much of this was thanks to Dennis, was bring people together to talk about the science, the policies, and the options for management. Of course, it was not all sitting in desks and rooms and meeting rooms with the, whether it was the Hudson River Estuary Management Advisory Committee or outings with the board of directors of the Hudson River Foundation, where Dennis was a key part of the seriousness and much appreciated by the board, generations of board members. He was part of the fun. He was able to mix the fun with and the socializing with pretty serious discussion that helped us all come better and more easily to understand things. He understood that a dry martini can enhance the understanding of weighty scientific treatises. Sometimes it was just fun. We did lots of birthdays, over 30 of Dennis's birthdays. He was big on those kinds of ceremonies, not ever more so than when he was celebrating important things in the life of his family. One of the things I knew every year when I tried to put together the calendar for the Hudson River Foundation, board meetings, federal holidays, all the things that you have to do to hope you have 3 days left where you actually can get some work done. One thing I had to start with was the Zakowski family calendar of special events. For Dennis, birthdays, anniversaries were sacred. He cared deeply about his family, and we enjoyed that. Pictures, stories. It was a real part of Dennis the man. Dennis and Mary Zakowski had 49 years together, and we're looking forward, anticipating with great joy more when he could do what he really wanted to do during the day, either hold a grandchild or catch a fish. It's a little ambiguous when we talk about Dennis as a friend of a fish. I wouldn't say he was always the best friend, but he really cared about them, wanted to do what he could to understand them, to help others understand them, and to get us where we are today at this symposium about the ecology of the Hudson River and the fishes who dwell therein. Thank you.
Clay, would you like me to begin now?
Yes, sorry, I thought you could hear me. Yep, go.
So Clay asked me to share some memories of Dennis, who was chairman of the Hudson River Estuary Management Advisory Committee for 32 years. The advisory committee, known as FREMAC, advises DEC in the management of the Hudson River Estuary Program, which I run. And I'd like to say that Dennis, over those 32 years, was really like a second boss to me. And he deeply influenced my leadership style. The one thing that really came through with Dennis was he set a tone right away that was very different from most DEC advisory committees. Most committees at DEC, there's a lot of table banging, a lot of speech making, but at REMAC, Dennis decided that that would be a venue for all voices to be equally heard in an atmosphere of collaboration and respect. There was not much voting unless it was unanimous, because Dennis wanted to give all voices equal weight. He didn't want to pit one group against another. He wanted DEC to hear and consider all points of view. He also brought considerable expertise to the table with his own knowledge of marine science, his understanding of government bureaucracy from having worked in federal agencies, and his professional connections to a larger universe of scientists and professionals. Dennis was responsible for many policy changes over his lifetime. One particularly pertinent today is the coast-wide sturgeon fishing moratorium. After New York State passed its own moratorium in the mid-70s, Dennis personally went to the New Jersey legislature and lobbied them to support a similar ban for all coastal waters, which was ultimately successful, even though it was not particularly easy. One thing I particularly remember about Dennis is the way he cleared his throat when he disagreed about something. He might not say he disagreed, he might not show his disapproval any other way. And I learned to listen for that little sound. I always paid attention. When Dennis passed, we asked our staff and our REMAC members to share recollections, and I'd like to read a few of them, which I condensed for today. I hope these memories will help all of us remember him more fully and help his family know how much he meant to so many people. So here we go. Eric Lind from Audubon. I always admired Dennis's ability to lead with kindness. Scott Cuppett. Dennis's style as a leader embodied the idea that everyone had valuable opinions, perspectives, and strengths that made all of us collectively strong. He found a way to make each of us feel important and valuable. Kristen Marcel. Dennis's dry humor helped us keep things in perspective. I don't recall him ever getting angry or upset. In fact, even in the toughest meetings and discussions, he was always patient, thoughtful, articulate, and able to forge a clear path, science always being paramount. He was unwavering in his clarity of purpose. Shino Tanakawa. Dennis knew how to criticize agencies in a way that made them want to listen to him. He wrote amazing letters telling the agencies to do right, but without antagonizing them. Andy Bicking. I'll remember Dennis as this rare person who set an example for others and inspired us to do better. I know I'm not alone in feeling so lucky for the time I spent with him. Amanda Higgs. Dennis was always open for a chat about anything, especially something Hudson River fish related. Dan Shapley. Dennis was deeply a part of our community, the community of people who found their calling in protecting this water body and the life that relies on it. Jim Tierney, Deputy Commissioner at DEC. Dennis was calm, intelligent, wise, dedicated, kindly, and effective. John Mylod, commercial fisherman. Dennis brought humor, subtle persuasion, and intellect to the task and guided the estuary committee on the path that leads to an ongoing and ever responsive program, an incredible legacy. Chris Bowser, our educator. Dennis was always curious, always engaged, always optimistic. Lucy Johnson, Vassar College and HRES. Dennis was a shining light in the environmental cosmos of the Hudson Valley. His scientific guidance led to an amazing collection of scientific information that will benefit all of us for years to come. Nancy Beard. Dennis helped the estuary program meet the challenge of taking an ecosystem-based approach to conserving and restoring our beloved Hudson River. And finally, I'd like to quote Sherry Mackey, the estuary program's administrative assistant, who said, "There are not enough words to describe Dennis. A few that stand out are kind, warm, welcoming, caring, and passionate." So Clay, thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to remember and honor Dennis today.
So, so I think I'm next. Thank you, Fran and Clay. Both Clay and Fran talked about the many ways Dennis contributed to the science of the Hudson River and inspired so many of us to be better students, researchers, and policymakers. So I thought I'd share one example of how Dennis, in his kind and caring way, and with his warm heart and great sense of humor, became my mentor and later my good friend, who inspired me to be a better scientist and a better person. I first met Dennis when I was still in graduate school, and Dennis asked me to attend a small workshop he was putting together with the sediment brain trust of the Hudson. Both Dennis and I were sediment geeks, so we had a bond early on. This meeting had scientists like Henry Bokinevich, Rocky Geyer, Larry Sanford, and Joe DiLorenzo. I always remember Dennis welcoming me into that group as a peer and his warm and supportive way of asking questions when there's clear everyone, I'm sure him as well, that I had no idea what I was talking about. He continued to support me when I got my first job with the Corps of Engineers, and then more directly as my supervisor and again mentor after I started working for the foundation now almost 20 years ago. I've seen Dennis do the same for many people just starting out. He was always looking for people he could support and inspire to grow into the next generation of scientists. Making science integral to decision-making is a key part of our mission at the Hudson River Foundation. Today's seminar is an example of one way we work to do this. Simple as a goal statement, but as we all know, extremely difficult to do. Dennis spent his career doing this and did it better than anyone I've ever known. So my examples will echo those you've heard from Fran and Clay, but I'll do them anyway to give you my own perspective. So the first thought that comes to mind is that Dennis was absolutely brilliant. His ability to quickly absorb new information, filter out the noise, and simplify complicated scientific issues across a wide range of disciplines was, in my mind, simply unmatched. Dennis never lost his enthusiasm to learn or his desire to solve complex problems. He truly loved his job, he loved learning, and he always believed he could make a difference. Dennis believed in people and made incredibly strong friendships and connections. And because of his strong connections with people, he was able to inspire others to advance the science, policies, and actions that ultimately benefited the river. This last point, Dennis's relationship with so many, again, as echoed by Clay and Fran, may have been his greatest strength. Dennis always tried to make everyone feel welcome and part of the community and part of the solution. So please join us as we observe a moment of silence in remembrance of Dennis and his contributions to advancing the science and management of the Hudson River, and in recognition of all the people he has touched. Now I'd like to introduce Chuck Nieder. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, Jim. And thank you, Clay, for such a moving tribute to Dennis, and Fran and Jim for your thoughtful reflections. The symposium is a fitting tribute to Dennis, who we all know loved to fish, loved the Hudson River estuary, and dedicated his career to ensure the latest scientific understanding guided complex management decisions. And he always did so with utmost respect and compassion. And there'll always be a hole here where he was, but he certainly has made a difference for many of us and for the Hudson and the Hudson Valley. The Hudson River fish community has long been an important social, economic, and ecological sector of life in the Hudson Valley. Over the past 4 weeks, we've heard from 17 scientists and resource managers presenting the latest scientific understanding, the complex management decisions needed to be made, and pointing out the gaps in our understanding with the impacts caused by climate change, invasive species, offshore commercial fishing, surge barriers, and dams. So as Jim Morrison said today, we've invited 5 of those speakers back to identify their view of critical knowledge gaps and priority research areas needing to be filled. And so we're going to hear from each of them now. And first up, I'm going to introduce Dr. John Kramer, who Dennis let the cat out of the bag, is soon to be the executive director for Hudson River Foundation. And we certainly welcome him to the Hudson Valley. I've known John for quite a few years, and he worked on a few projects with him. He's right now from the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center at the University of Maryland, and he's going to kick off this session. He will also wrap things up at the end by leading today's panel of experts in a discussion of where scientific research should be focused in the coming years. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kramer.
Thank you, Chuck. It's a great privilege for me not only to think about my changes in the next 10 days or so when I have the great task of taking over for Clay Hiles, but also to introduce this session. You know, the Hudson River Foundation's mission of supporting research that helps us understand and manage this unique ecosystem has from the very beginning placed high priority on understanding key fisheries that are found here. The Foundation's research support has in many ways been a catalyst for exceptional fisheries scientists, and especially for engaging an exceptional set of researchers who have contributed important insights over the years. The speakers who have been with us over the past 4 sessions all are clearly part of that group. Their work has helped us understand the many species that use the estuary, the river, and the watershed writ large. On behalf of all of us at the Foundation, I want to express my sincere thanks to them for their generosity in making time for us all. As has been mentioned, the Foundation has embarked on a year-long process to evaluate our progress over the many years we've been in existence and to craft our next strategic plan. This symposium has provided us with a really wonderful opportunity to partner with the Hudson River Environmental Society to advance those planning efforts. The theme of an ever-changing ecosystem is central to how we are thinking about our new strategic plan. And as we have all heard over the past weeks, the challenges in the fisheries arena are many and increasingly complex. They extend across biological and physical boundaries, across wide temporal and spatial scales, and include the deep social, cultural, and economic interactions that define how human communities perceive and impact fish and the ecosystem writ large, and how those fisheries impact humans in turn. The Foundation's challenge then is to be able to look ahead and ask what science is needed now to help those who are making critical decisions over the next 5 years. What new knowledge is going to be essential to increase the likelihood of successful decision-making? But we've also challenged ourselves to think beyond just the next 5 years. The drivers of change that our speakers have discussed will impact the Hudson over long-term timeframes. And we need to understand what research needs to be in place to help us address these long-term trends and their impacts on fisheries, the ecosystem, and human communities. What also comes with this is developing a much better understanding of the durable research capacities, both research tools and researchers of all disciplines that need to be engaged and sustained in the years to come. Our plan will have to find ways to balance these short and long-term approaches while also acknowledging a growing sense of urgency to provide science that can help us conserve and restore this vital resource in the face of ongoing change. With all this in mind, we've created a process to glean some additional insights from all the speakers over the last four sessions. After each day's public sessions, we've convened a short panel discussion for that day's speakers. In the simplest sense, the goal of each of those sessions has been to ask the speakers to understand not just what we know, but what we need to know if we're going to be able to better adaptively manage fisheries in the years to come. And while we started by thinking about research gaps, you very clearly heard some of those research gaps and critical needs. It also became clear that new approaches and new ways of thinking are going to be required if we are to be successful. Finally, while each panel was focused on the priority topics of that day, we invited speakers from the other sessions to listen in and look for commonalities, differences, and places that are particularly important intersections. Today, we're going to hear from those individuals who both participated as panelists in those closed sessions and also listened in. We've given them a really difficult task of synthesizing quite a bit of information, and to use that to help us look at the Hudson, help us at the Hudson River Foundation focus on what is most important and what will best match our mission going forward. But we all think there are broader lessons to be learned from what we'll hear today. Our hope is that what emerges will help influence research agendas, new research partnerships, and new resources in ways that can have the impact we seek. In all respects, we see this as the beginning of many more conversations to come. And I want to invite you, the panelists, and all those who are listening in to come with us as we begin to develop new ways of thinking about this ecosystem. So with that as introduction, I'll turn the floor back to Chuck, and I'll come back, as he said, towards the very end to moderate a panel discussion. Chuck will now introduce Chris.
All right. So first is Dr. Christopher Solomon from the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, who will discuss where a scientific effort should be directed to better understand the fishes of the Hudson River in an ecosystem context. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chuck. And I wanted to thank Clay and Fran and Jim for their reflections on Dennis earlier as well. Let me get my screen up here. Okay, I'm going to assume that's good, but hopefully Chuck or somebody will shout if it's not. So I'm going to try to talk just very quickly about some ecosystem research priorities as they relate to fish in particular. So this is reflections on what we've heard over the past few weeks. And as John just said, both in the public session and in those sort of afterwards debrief sessions. And I've tried to do my best to pull together what I heard as themes from that series of talks over the past few weeks. And as sort of a prop for working through that, I'm going to try to use this diagram that I showed in my talk several weeks ago, which is just a little bit of a kind of systems diagram of the social ecological system of the Hudson, at least as it relates to fish and fisheries. And so I'll go through and just highlight a few sort of pathways through this diagram, I guess. One has to do with habitat, and I heard a bunch of important questions about habitat as we went through these past several weeks. I'm going to highlight, first of all, that habitat is changing in a lot of different ways in the Hudson. So that first bullet point there is about some of the important kinds of habitat change that we heard about. Sea level rise, its impacts on things like the salt front in the river, and also on things like marsh habitat, both of which are important potentially for fishes. Restoration of side channels or removal of dams and the tributaries to the Hudson are both important aspects of habitat. We heard about submerged aquatic vegetation beds and their resilience to large storms. Infrastructure impacts, both the current infrastructure along the river and also the possibility of new infrastructure, as Heather Juloff mentioned in her talk, things like a surge barrier or new transmission lines. And of course, climate change you could think of as also an important aspect of habitat. And so trying to boil down what I heard to three important questions there, I think one was basically trying to make the link from habitat to fish productivity. So there was a sense from a lot of the speakers that habitat is somehow linked to the abundance and productivity and distribution of fishes in the river, but that we don't always understand that as well as we might like to. And so one potential research priority would be to try to improve that understanding. I think the second step in that link, that's the link from habitat to fish productivity. You can take a step back and ask, okay, well, if we manage to know what the key habitats are, what the key habitat features are, what are the features or the changes in the environment that are going to influence those key habitats? So things like changes in climate, again, changes in human infrastructure. What will those mean for the habitats in the river in ways that then influence the fishes? And then one interesting idea that we heard from several speakers, I want to say Yang Chen and Kathy Mills both brought this up, if I remember correctly, was that we need to do this work on understanding the impacts of habitat on fishes, not just empirically, but also to think about how we integrate our understanding of habitat influences on fishes into the models that we use to manage those fishes. So I think that's an important research frontier in the Hudson and beyond. And I'm going to try to advance the slide in the right direction now. So that's a bunch of ideas about habitat. Another theme that I heard was about food webs. One question there centered around food web productivity and understanding the primary and secondary production in the river that supports the fish populations that we're talking about in this seminar series. And one example that I've highlighted here that I thought was particularly interesting to think about, and this was brought up by Scott George, if I remember correctly, was thinking about the potential for round goby to get into the river and what that might do to the size structure in particular of Dreissena mussels in the river. And we know from work by Dave Strayer and others that those Dreissena mussels and the size structure of those mussels has big implications for plankton in the river. And of course, plankton are food for baby fishes. And so, there's a whole series of connections from an invasive species to another invasive species through the food web of the river to then maybe having implications on fishes. So an example of how understanding the food web may be important for understanding what goes on with the fish. Another theme that we heard a lot about from several speakers was thinking about phenology of events on the river and ideas like match mismatch. So Chris Knack, for instance, spoke about changes in spawning timing of striped bass and I think shad was their species that he talked about. And so thinking about, okay, well, with the timing of spawning changing and therefore the timing of when larval fish are in the river, with changes in things like freshwater flow, what does that mean for when we have vulnerable stages of fish in the river and how that does or doesn't match up with peaks in productivity of, again, things like plankton. So a common theme there, understanding not only the what or the how much of the food webs, but also the timing aspects of that. We heard a lot about trying to understand the players in the food web. So who will those players be and how will they interact? And there were a lot of reasons to think that the players in the food web will be changing. We heard about range shifts up and down the coast and in and out of the river. We heard about invasions and also extirpations of species from the river. And then we had some prompting, I think this is in one of the debrief sessions from Dave Strayer, to also be thinking about assisted migration, a question that's coming up in a lot of contexts relative to climate change, and a question that Dave encouraged us all to be thinking about as we think about what the river is going to look like over the coming years. Okay, we talked about social ecological dynamics, and I'll pull out a few particular research priorities there. One that we heard about from several folks was understanding the diversity of anglers and also of other stakeholders who are interested in the fish in the river. And I think diversity of anglers you could think about in a lot of ways, their motivations, where they live, where they come from. So there's a lot that we don't know about those anglers and their motivations, and then what those motivations mean for how those anglers are going to respond to changing fishery conditions. And we had some discussion about that both in the river and the estuary itself, but also in the marine environment where there are important recreational fisheries as well as commercial fisheries on many of these species. So how can we understand not only how the fish species are going to change, but then how the fishing on those species will change in response. We had a bunch of discussion about some of the key factors to understand for some of these species where recreational fishing is a major source of mortality. And one issue that came up there was understanding release mortality. There were some statistics presented, perhaps by Dave Secor or someone else, I don't remember, talking about the extent to which striped bass are heavily fished in marine environments, and the fact that many striped bass are caught and released, way more than are caught and harvested. And so it's important to understand what the mortality rates are from that catch and release fishing. And it's a thing we still don't have a great handle on. And then some interesting prompting to consider ways to strengthen the connections between the public at large and the science and management that we do on the river. And a provocative talk from Olaf Jensen on that in particular, I think, and making sure that that as scientists and managers, we work to maintain the perceived legitimacy of the science and management enterprise to the people who have a stake in those resources. To some extent, I think that's not a research question. It's a question about outreach and talking and how we interact with groups that aren't in science and management directly. But I think there's also some research that we can think about doing there about effective ways to engage with the important stakeholders. Okay, there's a group of ideas that came up that I'm going to call shovel readiness. And here are some of those. Heather Gierloff, I think it was, encouraged us to think about the fact that infrastructure projects are going to be happening. And she talked about a bunch that are kind of on the horizon. And so there are going to be offset projects that are mandated as a result of those infrastructure projects. Where should those offsets happen? What kinds of restoration or remediation should happen as offsets for those infrastructure projects? And how should we do them? And there's a clear need to do more research to prioritize that. There was some interesting discussion about the impacts of dams and whether or not it makes sense to prioritize dam removals. So George Jackman talked a lot about the impacts of dams, and there was some discussion about the idea that right now, a lot of the dam removals that happen are sort of opportunity based. There's an opportunity to remove a dam, and so that's the next priority dam because that's the one that's possible to remove. And I think an interesting question to ask ourselves is, can we see getting to a place where it would be useful to have a clear prioritization of which ones we ought to be going after if we could, or is it always going to be opportunity based? Some discussion from Scott George and others about ways that lock operations in the Mohawk might be modified to improve passage of river herring and other fishes up into the Mohawk. So again, these all relate to infrastructure and the way that we operate infrastructure and doing the research to sort of seize opportunities and make sure that we operate that infrastructure the best way we can. And then I think the last set of ideas that I want to talk about is some ideas that popped out to me about how we do research about the ecosystem and about the fish and their role in the ecosystem. And here are some of the themes that I heard there. One was about monitoring, and there was a lot of concern about this, obviously, because of the somewhat uncertain future of the Hudson River Biological Monitoring Program. There's a real opportunity to do the research that we need to try to optimize the successor of the HRBMP as much as we can optimize that kind of thing. And there's some interesting conversations going on, I think, about how we might integrate research better with that monitoring process. And so, making good monitoring about answering research questions, and therefore making research, explicit research, very much a part of the monitoring process. A bunch of ideas came up about integration and synthesis, and I think a few parts of this that stood out to me. One was integration across disciplines and different kinds of data sets. I think one of the really neat things about this seminar series has been the opportunity to hear from folks with very different expertise who are all thinking about basically the same question and the same problem here. I think that's a challenge for us to continue to strive towards, is integrating across those different expertises as we work to understand the fishes of the Hudson River. I think integrating from the headwaters of the Hudson all the way out to the ocean and back again. Again, we were really fortunate in this seminar series to have some experts on the lives of many of these fishes when they're out in the ocean. And I think there's space for better integration of that expertise with the things that we typically do in the river. And then a suggestion from John Kramer, actually, that we should be perhaps thinking about opportunities to glean more from comparisons of the Hudson with other large estuary systems, and thinking about the ways in which the Hudson is really unique and the ways in which it's similar to those other estuaries. And so what can we learn from those similarities and those differences? Stuart Finlay encouraged us to think not just about the slow changes, things like climate change and sea level rise that are slowly altering the way that the ecosystem and the fish interaction with the ecosystem works, but also to keep our eye out for the step changes that will happen. You know, when a big storm comes through and sets back submerged aquatic vegetation beds, that may be a step change in the river. And so we need to be prepared as researchers to be ready to understand that. And then some really interesting discussion about sort of the tension between understanding complexity and mechanism versus boiling away that complexity and mechanism to focus on the simple messages that have to do with applying science to management of the river. I think that's an important question to wrestle with as well. When do we need to embrace the complexity? When do we need to know more about mechanism? And when is it that we know enough and we just need to implement what we know and then move forward? So I think those are the themes that I saw over the past several weeks, taking the ecosystem perspective on the future of fishes in the Hudson River. I'll stop there, and thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So next we have Greg Kenny, who works for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and the Marine Resources Division, and he will discuss what more he thinks we need to know about Hudson River fishes to effectively manage them for commercial and recreational harvest. Thank you, Greg.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. Well, first, John Kramer, I just want to thank you for acknowledging that this was a difficult task that you laid on us. And I'm not entirely sure I was up for the task, but I did my best. I think the way I approach this is kind of talk about some simple ideas in the beginning, and then try to kind of capture the main pieces, the specifics that I heard in the conversations right at the end. So along those simple ideas, things are changing. We're seeing here shad abundance is at all-time lows. Chris Knack showed us how the timing of spawning for shad is changing. We've had species disappear from the river. We've had new species arrive in the river. And managing fish populations is difficult. And this section specifically, the fisheries management section, is where we're talking about managing the fisheries themselves. So things we can do by adjusting, harvest limits, gear restrictions, seasons, that sort of thing, managing the fisheries. But many of the changes that we're seeing are not really related to fishing, or we don't know how much a role fishing plays, and it may not be possible to manage those with fisheries regulation. I tried to steal this slide from Dave Strayer's talk, and it's a little awkward, but you can get the gist here. We used to have rainbow smelt in the river, and now we don't. And some have told this as a climate change story. Dave Strayer made a really strong case that a fungal parasite may well have been involved, or the entire reason. But it wasn't fishing pressure on rainbow smelt that caused us to no longer have rainbow smelt in the Hudson River. So if this was a fish population where we wanted to intervene, we would have needed data about fish in the ecosystem. We would have needed the predictive tools necessary to know this was coming. And we would have had to identify actions that probably aren't related to fisheries to change that. So I'm going to try to talk about traditional fisheries management and some of the issues that we're seeing now through a little analogy. I'm going to go with a checkbook analogy. So this is our straight bass checkbook. You know, each couple of weeks we get a paycheck, and that would be kind of similar to the recruitment of striped bass that we have each year. Then we have our regular bills, the oil bill, the gas bill. That's the fishing harvest that we have each year. And in the simple list of systems, fisheries, that's it. You've got your regular bills, you got your regular paycheck, and it's easy to keep track of. But things become more complex. Dan Miller told us that, you know, how much habitat we've lost over time. We're also restoring habitat. Dave Secor described the ocean bycatch. Kathy Mills told us how the ocean is warming. George Jackman told us dams are being removed. So these are all fairly simple things. Some of them are good, some of them bad, but I think they still kind of work in the simple checkbook analogy. But now, Kathy Mills also told us that oceans and estuaries are warming at different rates, and things may be thrown completely out of whack. Chris Knack described how shad in the river might be spawning at a totally different time of year for our kids than it did for our parents. Heather Gearloff described some industrial proposals in the river unlike any we've ever seen. Scott George told us how the Gobi is on the way through the canal system. Dave Strayer made it clear that there will be more invasives joining, probably. Some probably will have significant effects. Some might have huge effects, but we're not really sure if or when they were going to happen. And of course, climate change is going to cause an increasing number of significant storm events at some unknown interval and have some unknown severity of impact. So the only way I could figure out how to incorporate this into the checkbook analogy is that some of our bills are now going to have to be paid with Bitcoin. And of course, we can't keep this guy quiet. Oh, where did he go? There he is. Can't keep that guy quiet. So we don't know how much that bill is going to be. We don't know how much it's going to cost and when we're going to have to pay it. So you might see that and say, well, maybe we just shouldn't be doing any fisheries take at all, because just leave the money in the checkbook to make sure we can cover the bills. But Olaf gave a great talk about, you know, kind of the reduced opportunities for commercial fisheries, for recreational fisheries. And, you know, there are entire communities that the economy is driven by fishing in them. And, you know, we do live in a democracy. So at some point, if we're not careful, we could end up with the checkbook being tossed into the Boston Harbor. We are making improvements along these lines, I think, with fisheries management. Like a couple that come to mind are ecological-based fisheries management, which, sticking with the checkbook thing, you know, if you leave a little bit more money in the Menhaden checkbook, you can use the interest and pay off some of the bills in the striped bass account for that. And Kathy Mills and Yang Chen described ways that we can better understand the impacts that the changing climate is going to have on fish populations and how we can account for those. But it's unclear to me how much of these fish population problems we're going to be able to solve with fisheries management adjustments. So just very simply, the needs is, from what I heard in these conversations, are we need data about the fish, about the ecosystem, about the environment, and we need to be able to forecast what's going to happen in the future. And then we're going to need to be able to kind of use that to guide management options that we actually have. And we may need to have more options besides just managing fisheries. And for a lot of these species and a lot of the threats, to me, it's not clear exactly what those actions are going to be in a lot of cases. Okay, and so finally, these are just the main points that I heard in the discussion after the fisheries management talks, which I think are the kind of specific things that fit into that framework, what I described for fisheries management needs moving forward. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Greg. So next up, I have Heather Gearloff, also with New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. She's with Marine Resources also and is the manager of the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve. She will discuss what natural resource managers need to know to be able to make management decisions on existing and potential future physical alterations to the Hudson River ecosystem. So thank you, Heather.
Thanks, Chuck. So just as a reminder, yes, I did present on all the stressors that we see on the horizon, including power generation, power transmission, storm surge barriers, and anchorages. You know, that we've been hearing a lot of unknowns. We don't
I think we just lost Heather. So why don't we move on to Kathy Mills. I'll get in touch with Heather, see if we can find out what's going on. So Dr. Catherine,
oh, sorry, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes,
I think I had some kind of crash go on. Okay, so let me just pick up where I left off. Luckily, I was only a little bit into it. So with all the unknowns that we have, including how the Hudson will change with sea level rise and what invasives we can expect, there's a lot of things we don't know. But what I know is that they're safe to say there will be impacts. And that's going to be due to power generation, power transmission, storm surge barriers, and anchorages, because New York and the nation are moving towards increasing supply and delivery of renewable energy and having to adapt with the impacts of more severe storms and sea level rise. So in my presentation, I noted there's a lot of impacts that we can predict, right? We know that the bottom of the river will be disturbed with cable installation. There's a potential for increased water temperatures and maybe an emittance of electromagnetic fields. And if we're going to improve our ports to increase manufacturing in the Northeast, we're going to require dredging of the river and the bottom habitat and stabilizing shorelines. And with tidal generation, the potential is really high for fish mortality as those turbines move under that water. And of course, as we build storm surge barriers or other barriers, we're likely going to change, and we know we're going to change water movement. And we know we're going to change the way that sediment moves in the river and how it interacts with the ocean. And certainly fish have to navigate all of that. What we don't know, are these benefits gained from these projects with energy transmission, storm surge barriers, anchorages, are they going to outweigh, the benefits of those going to outweigh the cumulative impact from those projects? I mean, I love this depiction because it shows the complexity of how the ocean, the harbor, the river, and the tributary all interact. It's literally impossible to know the answer to that question. So where do we start? We have to start somewhere. And so I think that we have to start with number one, modeling the potential for impact. And number two, monitoring during pre-post of construction of these projects. So if we don't know, let's use the best available model so we can predict the potential impacts. And after we have those preliminary outcomes and we've designed a project so it minimizes those impacts, let's monitor that project. Let's look to see what the bottom looks like. How does the bottom recover after a cable is installed? Is the temperature increasing with a direct current cable installation? And if a storm surge barrier goes in, let's require that we monitor how that water is moved, even in the smallest of barriers, so we can.
Heather, are you sharing your screen?
Oh shoot, I'm sorry. Let me share again.
No, fine.
Okay, so I'll just pick up here. The alterations that, so if we have a project getting installed, let's monitor. Let's look at the bottom of the river. Let's look to see if the bottom is recovering after installation of the cable. And let's learn a little bit from every little project. We should, so we can more totally understand how those models, how are they good at predicting what the impacts might be. And so where do we go from here? What are the knowledge gaps and research needs? And I think these are all things that we've heard from other presenters. But we need to continue learning about the fish species and the habitat they utilize, and how will they adapt over time, and how will those habitats adapt over time. We have to learn a little bit more about how these projects are impacting the Hudson, specifically thinking about cumulative impacts. And there's a lot of modeling being done on the bigger questions, so offshore wind, storm surge barriers across the Northeast, work along the West Coast. But we need to know how those projects impact the Hudson specifically. And of course, it's not just one project. If we have all these projects, we are going to have cables, we're going to have offshore wind turbines, tidal turbines, storm surge barriers. So is there a way that we can offset the cumulative impacts? And just as Chris and Greg mentioned, we have to be at the ready to decide on what kind of ways can we offset those cumulative impacts. We have to have ideas as to what mitigation can be proposed to offset those impacts. And we have to be more informed on impact analysis. We have to know more about those benefit versus cost. So in my opinion, I really think we need to focus in on modeling and monitoring and really refining that assessment of impacts versus benefit. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Heather. So next we're going to hear from Dr. Catherine Mills. She's with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. She's going to discuss the gaps in our understanding of how climate change will impact coastal fishes. Thank you, Kathy.
All right. Thank you, Chuck, and thanks to the previous speakers as well. We've heard a nice recap of a lot of information. And so I'm going to follow on with a focus on climate change and fish populations and fisheries and some of the themes that emerged on that topic during the prior sessions. Next slide, please. Thank you, Sam, for running my slides. I presented an overview in session 3 that tried to bring some of the perspectives we have built on climate change and warming in the oceans and its effects on fisheries to this conversation around, obviously, estuarine change in the Hudson. And so some of the topics that we discussed and highlighted is that warming is one of the strongest changes that we are seeing in the region right now. So the waters of the Northeast Shelf, which are the waters on the coast and offshore from Cape Hatteras up to the Gulf of Maine, have been warming about 3 times faster than the global ocean warming rate since the satellite sea surface temperature record began. In the past 15 years, we've been warming about 6 times faster than the global average rate over that time. And that's a time period that obviously is relevant to species, their biological processes, and interactions in the ecosystem. And as we have experienced this strong warming trend, we're also seeing changes in seasonality. So the timing of seasons in the Northeast Shelf region, we've particularly seen an expansion of the period of time that feels like summer. So spring warms up earlier and fall cools down later, leaving a longer period in between that sort of feels like summer to the species in the ecosystem. Next slide, please. We've also been experiencing unusual temperature events. So in 2012, we experienced a substantial marine heat wave across the Northwest Atlantic, where we saw temperatures running about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius during the summer, above the long-term average. And this heat wave spanned from Iceland down to Cape Hatteras and all the way north to the Arctic and the Labrador Sea. So this really caught our attention to an unusual and high magnitude event in the ocean, led to the first use of heat wave in a marine setting. Since that time, though, as we overlay these events on the warming trends that we are experiencing, in the Gulf of Maine at least, and I need to run the analysis for the full Northeast Shelf, we have seen heat waves occur again in 2016, 2018, and 2020. So these events are becoming more frequent and will exert pulse-like pressure on the ecosystem. Next slide, please. And while a lot of the discussions focused on warming, we also need to pay attention to other ways in which climate change may affect physical characteristics of the ecosystem. So precipitation is particularly important in estuarine systems, as it has the potential to not only change the flow magnitude and timing of flow, but also the salinity in the estuary and where the salinity wedge occurs in systems like the Hudson. And obviously there are many other important changes associated with climate change that can affect marine and estuarine ecosystems from their habitats through their fish communities. So next slide, please. As we experience these physical changes, the effects can play out in many different forms for fish populations and communities. And in the Northeast region, we are seeing changes that have already been documented for many species that play out in many different ways. I'm just going to highlight a couple of these in my comments today. Next slide, please. So one of the most commonly reported changes in fish on the Northeast Shelf is a change in spatial distribution across many of our species and stocks that are routinely monitored on the Northeast Shelf. We have seen species shifting northward and to deeper depths as they track their preferred temperatures. There's one example that shows silver hake moving from the mid-Atlantic up into the Gulf of Maine region, and there are a number of other species that follow this same pattern. As we look to the future and project species distribution changes under temperatures that are expected in the future, we see for many of the mid-Atlantic species an overall expansion of habitat available to them, but a shift in location such that many of those will find that habitat further north and even moving into the Gulf of Maine region. So while there may be a sort of increase in favorable conditions overall, those species may no longer be located in places that are currently relying on them as a basis for their fisheries. So next slide, please. We've also seen, and interacting with changes in spatial distribution, we have changes in population productivity. So I shared an example of lobster and how we have seen southern New England populations decline as they've hit temperatures that are stressful to the species, but the warming that we've experienced in the Gulf of Maine has, over the past couple of decades, been favorable to lobsters and has really spurred the growth of the lobster population. But even as we continue warming there, we are projecting that there will be some declines. Karen Lindberg also highlighted 3 species that she considered potential climate victims, where we've seen major declines in the Hudson and potentially some relationships between these declines and climate conditions. So we've heard about rainbow smelt and American shad already, and tautog was another species that she brought into this conversation. Next slide, please. And although many of the studies of climate change and fish population changes have been focused on single species, it is really important to also consider that one species is not changing in isolation of others. So John Waldman brought some points around biodiversity changes and changes in community composition in the Hudson into the first session. And in particular, I found this slide really compelling, where this is an analysis of changes in the fish community composition for one of the routine surveys in the community, where he noted a major shift in the composition of the community starting in 2012. And this he associated with the 2012 heat wave that I just discussed. And from this example, we haven't really seen the fish community shift back to the prior 2012 state, which might be associated with ongoing heat waves that we are now experiencing. And obviously, as the community mix changes, so too do the food web interactions and relationships between species. Next slide. So just to move into thinking about some of the research needs that came up in association with climate change and fish populations and fisheries, I want to start by just emphasizing the importance of long-term monitoring data for a lot of work that has been done in this arena. A lot of my work really relies on the offshore federal surveys that have been maintained for, 4+ decades now. And I think the Hudson is actually a really unique case and is really well positioned for looking at climate impacts and understanding future changes because of the long-term monitoring programs that are in place in the estuary, in addition to observing systems that have been online for a while. And although the traditional surveys are incredibly important, it's also important to think about new tools that can provide higher resolution information, like telemetry work that is already ongoing in the river, and new monitoring approaches like eDNA. So although monitoring is important, it is also important to take that next step and to be able to tap into the data sets to analyze them for a variety of questions. And interplaying with that is the need to ensure that monitoring programs are designed for the questions that are important for the system. So when we think about climate change, we often think about long-term gradual change. And I hope what you've seen in some of these examples is that the effects don't always play out that way. There are regime shifts that can occur. We are looking at more and more large events that can exert short-term impacts on ecosystems. And in the case of changing phenology and seasonality, it's really important to be able to get to higher temporal resolution to understand change throughout the year. And I think, as I said, the Hudson is poised with a variety of data sets to tackle these types of questions. And I think, those may become even more used. We've seen in the past few years just incredible movement to open data and open science. And I think that will open up the potential for asking important questions for the ecosystem that can be distributed across many people. Okay, next slide, please. We also talked about the importance for focused studies to understand the impacts and particularly the mechanisms associated with those impacts for how climate change might affect estuaries. It's important to recognize that these studies might need to focus on multiple drivers, and they may need to account for change at multiple temporal scales, and should be expected to see responses that take many forms across the ecosystem. And so I think that it's also interesting in the Hudson to think about potential opportunities where these investigations can be applied to locally important questions, but also really contribute to the broader scientific understanding that's building beyond the ecosystem. And so I could have chosen many different fishery pictures here, but I think one of the unique aspects of the Hudson is the growing sort of focus on recreational fishing, and the fact that, many studies have focused on commercial fisheries, but not so many on recreational fisheries. And as we've already heard, they are a diverse set of fisheries operated by different types of people who will be affected in different ways by the changes and who will adapt to those changes in a variety of different ways. Next slide, please. Another third category of research directions, I think, is work that can really span and link habitats as they exist in the system, from rivers to the ocean, so that we can better understand habitat connectivity, the importance of that to fish populations, and beyond that, also thinking about community interactions. So this is just one slide that I showed in session 3, where we look at warming rates from rivers out to the ocean, and we see that the ocean is warming considerably faster. This is particularly in winter than the coastal waters, and those are warming faster than the estuary and river components of the Hudson. Next slide, please. And finally, just want to also recognize the importance of looking ahead. There's a lot that we can do with data and to build an understanding of change that has occurred, and understanding changes that have occurred provide one perspective on what might happen in the future, but it's also really important to deliberately take steps toward looking to the future. This can play out in frameworks that can focus on quantitative forecasting, but also all of this work doesn't have to be quantitative. I think there's some great work happening in more qualitative scenario planning environments where you can pose potential future changes and think through what that might mean for the ecosystem. I think this is particularly important in terms of evaluating how climate change might affect the potential to meet management objectives. We heard from a number of speakers that climate change can directly influence either limiting or promoting our ability to meet objectives that we may have for fisheries in particular. So thinking about how it affects the ability to achieve objectives that are important, what the form of impacts might look like, and proposing management strategies or adaptation approaches that can help address those impacts, and then having a formal framework for evaluating those and understanding the uncertainty associated with potential outcomes, I think will be increasingly important across many different ecosystems in the future. And I think the Hudson is a prime example for that. So I think those are all of my comments right now, and I look forward to a broader discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. So next we have Dr. David Strayer with Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, who will discuss where we should be focusing our research efforts to better understand the threat invasive species pose to Hudson River fishes.
Thank you, Chuck. I want to spend a few minutes talking about some examples of knowledge gaps in research areas with respect to the effects of non-native species on Hudson River fishes. And I need to acknowledge that this talk borrows freely from ideas that I heard from other speakers and in Q&A sessions and discussions over the last few weeks. I want to review just a little bit about where we are with invasions on the river. To remind you, there's lots of non-native species established in the freshwaters of the Hudson River basin. The record is about 150 species now. That's surely too low because we're missing a lot of inconspicuous species and the species down in the more marine parts of the estuary down south of the Tappan Zee Bridge. The current invasion rate's about 1 new species a year, as far as we can tell. And we know or strongly suspect that some of these invaders have had strong impacts, long-lasting impacts on Hudson River fishes. So, for example, zebra mussels, which eliminated about half of the biomass of forage invertebrates in the river, channel catfish, which have displaced the native white catfish, water chestnut, which has transformed about 600 hectares of the river shallows into these peculiar dense hypoxic habitats. And then we have several pathogens that have been poorly studied in the river, but have very possibly had strong impacts on the fish. We can also make some pretty confident predictions about the future if we continue business as usual. With an invasion rate of 1 new species per year, where I confidently predict 30 new species in the next 30 years. So we can expect to see a lot more invaders in the coming decades, as long as we continue doing what we've been doing. We can also predict that as the climate warms, we're going to be seeing new invaders from new source regions, either just in the southern US or in other warm climate parts of the world. And we can expect that effects of non-native species will accumulate and increase as new species appear. We've already heard about the round goby, or if we get the Asian carps in the river, we're going to see a rising of impacts. All right, so let me consider knowledge gaps in research areas in 4 different areas to the different stages of the invasion process. I want to start with prevention. Prevention is probably the best management opportunity for reducing the future impacts of non-natives on the river. And there's been lots of studies showing that prevention tends to be the most cost-effective and an effective method for reducing impacts of invaders. If we don't do this, we're going to get this surprise grab bag where we're going to get a bunch of new species in the future. One of the reasons I want to mention prevention is that how well we do with prevention sets the stage for what we will need to do with research and management for the species that appear.
in the future. If we do a good job preventing new invasions, and I remind you this is possible, the example on the right here is from the Great Lakes showing that when they imposed effective management, they stopped seeing shipping-related invaders in the Great Lakes. So if we impose effective prevention protocols, we won't see many new species, and we won't need to devote many research dollars or management dollars or effort to these new species. If we do a crummy job preventing new invasions, then there are going to be some high research and management priorities for the new invaders that appear in the future. As I said in my talk a couple of weeks ago, preventing new invasions is really more a political problem, application of existing knowledge than the lack of scientific knowledge. But there are some really promising research opportunities that can help us do a better job with prevention. Canal passage has come up in several of the talks, and this sort of balancing between preventing the arrival of new invaders through the canal versus allowing the passage of desirable species, especially in the lower Mohawk and the lower canal system. This is an area that could use some more research. Another, I think, really promising research area is we need to better understand human attitudes and actions concerning non-native species. This fits in the prevention box because regular people are the source of many new invasions, right? People dump their aquaria and release pets and things like that. And so we might be able to do a better job with prevention if we better understood why people are releasing non-native species into the environment and so forth. But this also applies to the other steps of the invasion process as well. So human attitudes and actions often interact with early eradication, early detection, management and control at later stages in invasion. And for those of you who aren't thinking about this, the mute swan example in New York and in other places shows us how important human attitudes and actions in the public are to invasive species control. The second area I want to talk about briefly is early detection and rapid response. This is another good opportunity for management if you can catch an invasion early enough to eradicate it. People have already mentioned the importance of optimizing or continuing existing biological monitoring programs. We could probably strengthen these existing programs by engaging citizen scientists. Scott George mentioned that a little girl was the source of a first detection in the east of round gobies in the eastern Mohawk, and this is something we can engage people with. We could also, you could imagine developing a list of high-risk invaders and then going out with targeted surveys using modern methods like eDNA to try to detect them. Such information on early detection could be used to develop decision trees to guide eradication of newly detected invaders and would rely on the development of legal authorities and protocols for rapid earlier eradication. I want to emphasize that all the items on this list belong together as part of an integrated program, right? It doesn't do you any good to detect new invaders early in the invasion if there's no framework for eradicating them. And likewise, if the best framework for eradication is not going to be very effective if you don't have people out trying to detect the new invasion. So this is really an integrated framework that could be done together by scientists, managers, and policymakers. The next area I want to talk about is what we do about understanding established invaders. I tried to emphasize in my talk that we don't understand well enough the effects of existing invaders on Hudson River fishes, water chestnuts and channel catfish and dreissenid mussels and so forth. And so, again, our existing biological monitoring programs are an important part of understanding the impacts of established invaders. Primary research projects targeted at understanding what these species are doing to Hudson River fishes. We could also explore interactions between non-native species and climate change. We've been hearing a lot about climate change and habitat change. Certainly, there are going to be strong interactions between these driving factors in non-native species. And this is an area that could be explored through modeling, for example, and so forth. The other thing I wanted to highlight, and I think Heather said something about this a minute ago, is we can use experiments or pilot level control at management relevant scales in the field to develop scientific understanding. So I emphasize that we don't fully understand what water chestnut is doing to Hudson River fishes. There's a chronic sort of ongoing interest in controlling water chestnut. It would be a really powerful scientific tool to actually manage several acres of a water chestnut bed in an experimental setting to where you could be following the fish and the links between fish and water chestnut to understand what water chestnuts are doing to the Hudson River fishes. The last area I want to talk about briefly is what do we do about managing established invaders. We don't do this very often right now because we don't usually have effective control methods. There's this persistent idea that once a species is well established, it's hard to control. That's really true, but that also assumes that you're not trying very hard to control it. And we've tried very, very hard to control things like non-point source pollution or point source pollution or stormwater runoff. And we have never really developed those similar kinds of resources to developing better control methods to problematic invaders. And so I think there is some room here to developing better control methods for problematic invaders if we're willing to spend a little more money to do it. However, if we're thinking really about doing system level control, then we clearly need a better understanding of the roles the invaders play, and then therefore what the impacts of the control program will be. So this better understanding of what roles the invaders actually play in the ecosystem could certainly be used to guide what kind of control to pursue. And that could certainly include no control. So thank you for your time this afternoon. I look forward to our discussion in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you, David. So now I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Kramer, who's going to lead the panel in a discussion. If you have any questions you would like us to ask the panel, please share them with us in the Q&A box. We'll get to as many of those as we can as time permits. So thanks.
Thank you, Chuck. If the panelists could turn their cameras on, that would be great. And while you're doing that, let me just say thank you. I started out by saying this was going to be a tough task, but you all rose to the challenge. Those were terrific talks, really insightful. And if anything, you challenged me to come up with some really good questions to see if I can provoke some responses from you all on the panel. The one I want to start with is sort of just an observation that I've had over the course of the 5 weeks that we've been together. And it's really perhaps a naive observation, but the observation is we're asked to think about fish, but in fact, you've asked us to think about ecosystems and the place of fish in those ecosystems, and whether it's a small scale, whatever small means, ecosystem in a water chestnut bed, or a completely coupled human natural system, or from the headwaters all the way out to the Atlantic. We wanted to think about ecosystems. So my question is, if we're going to think about managing fish species and fisheries in a different way, ultimately it gets you to ecosystem-based fisheries management. And we heard Greg talk about that, and I think many of you have sort of alluded to that. The question I have, where I'd like you to start, is how do we build the foundations for EBFM? It's not trivial. There haven't been a lot of good examples of EBFM working nationwide or worldwide, and I'm curious as to what do you think we need to do inside the Hudson over the next 5 years to build the foundations for ecosystem-based fisheries management?
So you're just going to start off with an easy one, huh?
I am. Greg, you said you weren't sure if you got it. You got it right, I thought. I don't need a specific, I'm curious. What is it that will help us build those foundations?
I don't know why I spoke up, because I don't know. I think that I think that is a very good question that would really help guide us. So I hope you get an answer. And it might take, I think it would take some kind of serious thought about what has been done already, and some research into the specifics of how it could be applied to identify those questions. I certainly can't do it off the top of my head.
Dave, you want to go ahead?
I will, I guess, jump in to offer a few things, but I totally agree with Greg. You know, this is a huge, huge question. You know, some of the thoughts that come to mind for me as first steps are that, you know, very few of our stock assessments take into account formally environmental conditions that might shape the fish populations that they are designed to understand and estimate population sizes for. And so I think that one first step is looking for whether there are environmental covariates that are influencing populations and the processes, the biological processes that shape stock assessment outcomes. I think that, and I haven't looked at this in a rigorous way, I think one, it's not that our stock assessment scientists don't screen for and consider these things. I think one of the challenges is that often we look at such long time periods that the environmental influence may not come through, and it may not look like it's important to consider that in the assessment. But I think in recent years, we are seeing, you know, quite dramatic changes that, you know, fishermen on the water are also discussing and reporting. And so I think it may also entail a different way of considering those influences that would account for the emergence of influence in recent years that may not be there if you look at the whole time series. So sort of thinking about non-stationarity in the system. Another thing that I think about in the context of fishery management is the value of identifying species that we think may be vulnerable to climate change, and thinking about how we may want to focus effort differently on those species. So if we can do a screening for vulnerability, what might that mean in a proactive way for how we may approach management discussions around those species? And then finally, as we see many species shifting, thinking about where there may be, what might new opportunities be in particular systems if you have species moving in or becoming more prevalent, and how does that intersect with our fishery management process? Being from Maine, you know, one of our big challenges is that we are heavily dependent on the lobster fishery. We expect there will be future opportunities for fisheries on species that are moving northward, but we don't have access to those species in a lot of cases, or our fishermen don't. And so, you know, I think bringing that discussion, it is starting to occur in the fishery management world, but that's another place where, you know, if we think of humans as part of the ecosystem, thinking about the human use of the resource as well and how we can facilitate that to continue is also important.
Kathy, Heather, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just going to build on what Greg and Kathy said, in that it is super complex. And one of the challenges being a person that has to look at a project proposal and assess what this proposal might do for an impact to those species, and how I have to think about how to influence that project proposal and or construction methods to minimize those impacts. With working with Greg and other biologists, it's really difficult to know the breadth of information that's out there. And I think one of the challenges that I find is that it's really hard for me to understand all the different aspects and what everybody has learned so far and what they're predicting. So as we go forward, I think one key thing for me as a regulator, and I think my coworkers in the same role across all the agencies, would be to have a better understanding as to the collective knowledge, as well as the potential for how that might change over time, just so that we are responsive. It's really difficult to make sure we're being totally responsive with the just vast amounts of information.
So does that speak to not just new scientific information, but a way of coordinating information exchange in a way that doesn't exist now?
Yeah, that would be incredibly helpful. I think our regulations really focus on certainly endangered threatened species. So something like Atlantic or short-nosed sturgeon rise to the top, but that doesn't mean there isn't value in understanding all the different life stages and their critical locations, so that as a project is proposed, I understand, where that project may have an impact. Is there anything that can be done to minimize those impacts? Because some of the projects that we talk about are likely going to go forward because they're critical for infrastructure or critical for, meeting the goals of not just New York, but of the nation.
Great, thanks, Heather. Dave or Chris?
I'm not a fisheries person, I'm sorry, and I don't know what ecosystem-based fisheries management is. It seems like, though, that the Hudson River community has kind of laid those foundations already. When I talk to the people who work on Hudson River fish, they seem very aware of things like environmental drivers, change in non-stationarity and invasive species and things like that, even if they're not always able to deal with them. So I think maybe more than other communities that the Hudson River community has had the right people in the room together. I mean, if you look at the action agenda, for example, there's lots of things besides fish in there. They're kind of tied up with fish. The other thing I'd say is that, and this is an obvious point, but you see what you look for. And if you plot just stock recruitment curves, then you're going to see stock recruitment relationships. You won't see the environmental relationships. And I'll tell you, I was just shocked to see these data on the smelt, the smelt pathogen, which is why I brought it forward in my talk, because I was very satisfied with this idea that warming eliminated the smelt. I wasn't looking at the biological side. So I think it may require some deliberate and sort of rigorously analytical ways of looking for these other influences to see if they're strong enough to demand this ecosystem approach and whether we have the ability to include them. But I think that unless you really try to look for them, you won't see them.
Go ahead, Chris, and I want to come back to Dave after that.
Go ahead.
So thanks, Chris. Dave, just to follow up, are those retrospective analyses? Are they new synthetic analyses? What is it that, just give me a little more example of, how you would go after some of these problems is more, using the rainbow smelt, for instance.
Yeah, well, that's really hard, right? So, so the answer is yes, that we have a terrific retrospective data set. In cases like with pathogens, we actually have an extraordinary specimen bank, right? Now at Stony Brook, I guess. And so you could certainly do targeted retrospective stuff. You could also do a lot of modeling, to put these things in models and see, well, how strong would the sort of climate signal have to be to really be visible in our data set or to change the fish? How bad would the pathogen have to be? So I can imagine doing all those things you mentioned, but I'm not a fish guy. I'm sorry.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. Chris, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, one thought that occurred to me, John, was thinking about sort of trying to forecast. A couple people have said things like this, I forget who. And there's this thing going on right now called the Ecological Forecasting Initiative. It's like a research coordination network. And I've been impressed with them thinking about how to stimulate that kind of thinking. They're doing it in some ways in systems that are easier than a big river fishery, right? If for no other reason than that, for a lot of the fish processes we care about, we get a data point once per year. And if you're trying to improve your ability to forecast things, that's really slow to get new data. But there's maybe an interesting model there of, maybe somebody like HRF can put out a forecasting challenge for Hudson River fisheries, right? And that's a way to stimulate a lot of investment in models and a lot of creativity in sort of a fun, competitive March Madness sort of way or something, right? And it would also serve to do some of the stuff that Heather was talking about there, I think, about providing an impetus for bringing together data sets and making them available to people, right? And having some central repository where everybody could go get some of the key data sets. I don't know. That was the random thought I had.
Well, thank you for that. and it cues up this other piece. I mean, one of the things that I was struck by over and over again, we hear it a lot, is the need for models, and models of various kinds, and the utility of quantitative and qualitative models. And I oftentimes wonder if these are new models entirely, or they're existing models that can be repurposed. Any sense on that? I mean, models come in all different flavors. They're all different kinds. Is there a need to start de novo, or is there enough there now, you think, just from your general knowledge, to be able to say these models can be useful and we can adapt them?
You almost never need to start de novo, right? I mean, there's got to be useful stuff there. I think for me, it's hard to say what the useful stuff is without focusing in on one particular question. Maybe you're talking about the ecosystem-based management question. But
possibly. I think there's other kinds of models that we've been talking about today already.
Yeah, I think there's lots of useful stuff out there, and maybe a thing we need to do is look harder for it and bring it in.
I would say let 100 flowers bloom. I mean, so one really trivial example, John, I talked about climate change and invasive species. So we think that zebra mussels mortality is probably going to go up when the river warms. And there's even some data from Michigan about how warm would kill them, right? We have a model that works perfectly well enough for zebra mussel population dynamics in the river. And so it'd be a natural enough thing to jack up the adult mortality and see if it changes, how much it changes the number and size of mussels in the river, and therefore whether river warming would ease this pressure from this invasive species. That's I don't want to say this out loud. That's something you can almost do this afternoon using existing models. And so I'm with Chris that there's an awful lot of modeling out there that can be modified and tweaked and sometimes very easily.
Right.
And I guess I am not a modeler, and but the thing that seems to limit the ability to do that, right, is the data itself that goes into the models. And this has been raised a number of times, so I'll just very briefly say that a lot of this data was collected through the Hudson River Biological Monitoring Program, and I think continuing to figure out a way to and collect the most important pieces of that survey is going to be critical for any modeling that we try to do that looks forward.
Right. I'm going to try a different approach. Go ahead, Kathy. Did you want to comment?
Well, I was just going to comment. I think that even if there are not modeling frameworks available sort of in the Hudson, there are many frameworks that have been developed outside of the Hudson that could be adapted to the system. And I think the interesting thing to me, when you start thinking across the different types of habitats in the Hudsons, would be a new need to couple models together likely, but the pieces likely exist. So you're not starting de novo with the pieces, but you may be putting them together in a way that is different because you're making it relevant to the system.
Great. I'm really struck by comments that Greg and Heather have made with respect to this notion of some things are manageable, some things are much harder to manage. And then there's this constant pressure of change occurring. Some of those are anthropogenic changes, whether they're large scale modifications or small scale modifications. Yeah, I had mentioned in my beginning talk today, this notion of shorter term needs and then longer term capacity building. Some of the modeling, maybe capacity building, bringing different kinds of scientists in is maybe capacity building, but do you have some pieces that you think are absolutely necessary right away? That decisions are going to be made in 4 to 5 years that really demand we try to produce some knowledge, to try some new kinds of science. What do you think? What are the things that are at the top of your list for short term? Is it forecasting? Is it scenarios? Is it
That's a modeling specific question?
No, that's a more general question. I mean, I really think what's looming on the horizon right now doesn't have to be modeling.
Well, I happen to know there's a couple of projects literally looming. And so, for us, when we were looking at those projects, some of those projects were created 2012. And the models that we talk about are the applicant going through modeling potential sediment movement as a result of their project, potential electromagnetic field output. But in 2012, the models didn't even exist for subaqueous cable emittance, right? And so today, they're just starting to learn a little bit more from offshore wind. So immediately we know the sediment on the bottom of the river will be disturbed in some form or another, because we know that there will be direct current cables buried underneath water bodies, whether it's Long Island Sound, the harbor, the ocean, the Hudson. We know that that is going to happen, right? We have all that knowledge. So, and there's still an incomplete information about what that impact is, right? We know a little bit about, in Massachusetts, the impact of a direct current cable on lobster, but that's not helpful for us on the Hudson. So we're gonna have to extrapolate that information and put it onto the species that might be foraging at the bottom of the river. So we can't make a direct analysis between lobster and, say, sturgeon. And so there's a lot of knowledge that we still need to have, but there's some preliminary work out there. So there's a way that we can start it, and then we can refine it. So immediately, in my opinion, on the river, we know that is on the horizon and very quickly. We know that there is going to be dredging on the Hudson, and that's either for port improvements or for marinas, because the sediment regime has caused that the sediment settles in shallow areas, which are also habitat and also navigational areas. So there are things that we know for sure are going to happen in the next couple of years. Storm surge barriers are something that are a little bit further out, but certainly people can be concerned about storm surge. How are they going to battle that? And likely, if it's not a full-on surge barrier across a gigantic section of the river, it will be little storm surge barriers. It'll be barriers of some kind, vertical walls. It'll be something. So on the horizon of the next 2 to 3 years or 5 years, bearing of direct current line, dredging of the river, and some kind of barriers.
Just to follow up, Heather, do you think that studies like that, and I'll use the word coordinated again, could be better coordinated to, I think you used the term cumulative impact. And is that a new research framework, not individual projects, but thinking about a framework that multiple partners could engage in such a way that the information can be shared to understand cumulative impact on fisheries?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges we have is that I have to review a project that's in front of me, right? Unless somebody previous to me has laid out that this is the cumulative impact, if we do this all 3 things in one spot, it's hard for me to advocate for one way or another. So as a person working for the department, looking at one particular project, it's really difficult for me. But it's the impact that we worry about. It's just really difficult to do that when we implement our regulations. So it would be helpful to have some outside party take a look at that. It would make it a little bit easier for us to do that from a regulatory standpoint.
Thanks. Greg, do you want to weigh in on that question at all?
Could you repeat it for me briefly? I think
Yeah.
I got it, but I just want to make sure I understand.
I'm interested in, you had mentioned in your talk the notion of some things are manageable and some things are not necessarily manageable. And I think you used the example of sort of large scale climate change as being, you can't manage for that directly like you would manage for harvest pressure. But when you start to think about what's manageable right now, what are the gaps that are in front of you? Research gaps.
The impacts of bycatch from a bunch of different fisheries related to Hudson River American shad and river herring is one. The whole movement of fish through the over the Troy Dam, if there is fish passage installed there, and then up through the Mohawk, better understanding what kind of impacts those movements have on the fish and whether or not there are things that can be done to limit the impacts. I think invasions through the canal, aquatic invasions through the canal are a massive threat. I don't know if I can specify exactly what action needs to be taken on that right now, but I think that's a massive, massive threat. And I guess another one is to consider ways to improve the way that we estimate spawning stock abundance for striped bass and American shad in the river.
Great, thank you. So my last question is maybe in the same vein as my first question, which is a hard one, but the concept of the resilience of this ecosystem, and then on the other side of that coin, how vulnerable the ecosystem is. How do we get at that? What's going to tell us if, Chris, you mentioned step changes at one point. Others have mentioned large-scale events or the accumulation of multiple stressors over time. How do we begin to understand if the system is resilient to change in any way, or if it's not resilient to change and we think we're close to a step change? How do we get ahead of that? How do we begin to understand the indicators for that? Chris, you're looking like I asked you an unfair question.
Yeah. I'm going to give an unfair answer. I'll give two answers. One is unfair. The unfair one is we don't. I think we react instead. And we kind of make ourselves ready to react and adapt to what we see happening. So that's the wiggle out answer. The other one is that, the only thing that comes to mind really is synthesis in various forms. Sort of mathematical modeling is one of those, but conceptual modeling and bringing people together to talk, I think, is another one. Trying to put together the best understanding we have and just explore, okay, well, if we push the system in this direction, what do we think will happen? It's a big system. It's awfully hard to understand fully. Those are my two answers. Dave looks like he's going to give a better answer than me.
Oh, but I'll give an answer. I don't think the system resilience is interesting as the resilience of certain components of the system, right? And so, with respect to the components that interest us in this symposium, the fish, I think it's pretty clear that the system has become more and more brittle, right? And less resilient. Look at the shad. And Greg, I hope you'll weigh in on this after I'm done. The loss of shallows, the loss of plankton from the zebra mussels, the bycatch offshore. I'm probably leaving some stuff out. All of those have left the shad population with less and less and less running room, less and less space, ecological space, where they can maintain a viable population. That's what I would say is going on with shad. And I would say that's definitely a loss of resilience, because then if you put one more thing in, and we're going to put one more thing in at some point, where's the shad going to go? How is it going to be able to maintain a population? So I think for a number of the components of the Hudson ecosystem that we care about, they clearly have become less resilient. And some of the threats we've been talking about, like climate change, are going to squeeze those I don't know what you call them, zones of viability smaller and smaller. Now, I don't know about system resilience, but that's how I'd answer it.
Thanks, Dave. Kathy, go ahead.
I guess I just wanted to weigh in. I think it's also important to recognize that, while you may be squeezing some species to smaller and smaller compatible options, you may be broadening those options for other species. And so I think, I'm kind of with Chris that it's really important I think it's a bit overshooting our capacity as ecologists to predict the changes that might occur in great detail because there are so many interactions. I think we can generally, look at the landscape of types of changes that may occur. I think it could also be valuable to identify what are the critical links in the system as it exists now, and to sort of really be able to focus in on those. But I think, change is not necessarily a sign that the system has broken down. I think that that is just to be expected. And so really it I think is important to keep the social ecological system perspective here, to not just be focused on one component or the other, because how prepared we are to look for those changes and to be ready to respond and adapt to them, both in terms of how we actually do formal management, but what our expectations are of a system as a society and just as people, I think is going to be really important. It's not so much a matter of stopping change or reversing, because there are so many things that are changing simultaneously in that mix. But, how can we ensure that the system that exists at any given point in time is one that's going to provide the benefits and services that matter to the community and the stakeholders that are involved?
Which I think speaks to understanding what those values are and what matters to a community, what benefits are most important, and how their view of the ecosystem or the species or the stretch of river changes over time, and how we understand that. I think from a personal perspective, Chris mentioned this before, we know very little about recreational fishing and how that's going to change, and the values of fishers up and down the river and what they want, and how those communities will value the option to fish, to eat the fish, et cetera, over time. A huge research gap, I think, that's come across in a number of talks. I think one last question. Let me just check my notes. One of the things that is really was interesting to me is in terms of capacity is, Kathy, you mentioned that the Hudson may be somewhat unique in having capacity with long-term monitoring, not just of fisheries, but long-term monitoring of biophysical characteristics as well through the RECOS monitoring system. One of the questions I think is going to be interesting for us is to figure out how do we leverage that over time. And do you have a sense of how others have done it well nationwide to use those different kinds of capacities to get a better understanding of ecosystems, or are there just not so many of them out there right now that have used different kinds of data in a comprehensive way?
I guess from my perspective, I feel like in the data-rich systems, that the few data-rich systems that we have available around the world, you see some incredible work to really understand change, the drivers of change, and the way, and to be able to project to the future. I'm thinking of places like the Chesapeake Bay, Alaska and their fisheries, Australia, where, if you're operating in a wealth of data, it opens up doors to pursuing certain types of science that may not exist in many systems. And because those other systems continue to function and to operate in a different way, it doesn't mean that that you must have that scientific base, but I see it as a great opportunity in places like the Hudson to be able to dig in deeper and to ask questions that couldn't be asked in certain systems because you do cover multiple components of the ecosystem, and to have some greater confidence in your in the patterns that you are seeing, because you have a long enough time series to have potentially gone through opportunities to see patterns multiple times and to understand their repeatability.
Thank you, Kathy. And with that, we have reached 3:30, which is the end of our time for today. On behalf of all the organizers and myself, I want to thank you very much for just a terrific set of talks today, and really interesting and insightful. And you've given us at the foundation a tremendous amount of fodder for thinking about what our priorities will be. in a broad sense, I want to thank all of the speakers for the many days that you've been on board, and for the attendees who have listened. I hope this has been as useful for you as it has been for us. And then finally, I want to make sure that those who are tracking what's happening with our planning process, there'll be other opportunities to get your input over time. We'll figure out ways to do that and invite you to send comments to the foundation on what you've thought and heard here today. And with that, I also want to thank Clay Hiles and Jim Morrison for making sure this all came together in a really wonderful way. Chuck and Jim Lodge have been utterly fantastic in organizing, and they really deserve the lion's share of credit for making sure this happened in the best possible way. It's been really enjoyable for me to watch and listen and interact with the speakers, and I look forward to many more encounters with you over the years.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that, John. And I want to thank Sam Gordon too. He's been behind the scenes making sure that all the speakers and all of us were here on time, getting all the links to us and others, and also making sure Zoom worked seamlessly. We had like no glitches. And so thank you very much, Sam, for your attention on this and making this all work.
Thanks, Chuck. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks all.
All right. Thank you.